All right, well, it is officially noon, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started in the interest of everyone's time. My name is Brittany Mellinger. I am the Fair Housing Training and Outreach Coordinator at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and I am thrilled that you are spending your lunch hour with me today. We will be talking about the topic of fair housing and hoarding. Before we dive in, I want to cover just a few housekeeping items. I want to let you know that this session is being recorded, and we will make the recording available after today's training. We will also send out the slides from the presentation, so that way you all have access to that materials. I want to apologize that we are unable to offer ASL translation for this session. We had an unforeseen issue with getting that scheduled, but we will do our utmost to make sure that we will have that service available for future Fair Housing Empower Hour sessions, because we want to make sure that this information is fully accessible to everyone. For those of you who would like captioning, you can access that by going up to the three dots on the top of your screen that says More. You can go into Language and Speech and then select Turn on Live Captions, and that'll give you captions for today's training. Thank you all for everyone who has introduced yourself in the chat and said hello. So let's get started. So I want to let you know what we'll be covering today. Today, I'd love to give you just a brief overview of who we are at the Human Relations Commission before laying some of the groundwork for a discussion on hoarding. So we're going to talk a little bit about our fair housing laws, protected classes of individuals under those laws, as well as discriminatory actions. We're going to talk about reasonable accommodations since that's one of the main topics regarding individuals who are suffering from hoarding disorder and how they can engage and ensure their fair housing protections. We'll talk about a brief overview of what hoarding is, and then we're going to share some information on how housing providers, tenants, and other parties can work together to resolve hoarding situations. We always make sure to leave some time at the end of these trainings for Q&A, so you are welcome to go ahead and put any questions that you have in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them as I can throughout the presentation, but we will definitely leave some time to cover questions at the end as well. And I just want to acknowledge that this can be a challenging topic. Hoarding disorder impacts a lot of individuals. Some folks on the call, it might be impacting you personally. It might be impacting friends or family members, or you might be dealing with this issue in a professional setting. But I just want to let you know that our goal is to treat this in a respectful manner and to provide some tools and resources from a fair housing perspective that can help you address this. But without any further ado, let's get started. So the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission has been around since 1955. We've got a two-part mission. So the first part is to enforce Pennsylvania's non-discrimination laws, which include both the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act as well as the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. So if someone believes that they've experienced discrimination, whether that's in housing, commercial properties, public accommodation, education, employment, and any of the areas that we cover, they can file a complaint with our agency, and we can assess if it's something that we can investigate, and a neutral investigator will take a look at the facts of the case. But beyond reacting to situations when complaints are filed, we also proactively work to promote equal opportunity for all in Pennsylvania. So making sure that we have trainings and resources and events that are available to provide education and resources on a variety of topics. We cover the entire state of Pennsylvania. we've got three regions that are supported by our three regional offices. So in the western part of the state, our Pittsburgh office covers that section of the state, which is led by Regional Director LaDawn Robinson. The center part of the state up into the northeast is covered by our Harrisburg Regional Office, which is led by Regional Director Heather Roth. And then in the southeastern part of the state, that's covered by our Philadelphia Regional Office, and that is led by Regional Director Robert Lindsay. So our regional offices are the offices that do the day-to-day work of investigating complaints. But there's also central office staff that do outreach and education, such as myself. I want to touch on our fair housing laws. These form the basis for protections. So we've got laws at the federal, at the state, and the local level. So at the federal level, the most commonly known law is the Fair Housing Act, passed in 1968, but there's also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act, which provide additional protections for individuals with disabilities. At the state level, it's the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, which is enforced by our agency. And then at the local level, there are also local ordinances that may add additional protections. There are over 70 different local ordinances throughout Pennsylvania. So I'd love to invite you to pop into the chat if you're able, and if there's a local ordinance that provides additional protections, I'd love for you to share about that, since we do have many of those that are operating throughout our state. But what do our fair housing laws actually do? So the Fair Housing Act has two main goals. The first one is the one that most people are most familiar with, preventing discrimination. So making sure that people are not experiencing discrimination when they're seeking to rent or buy a home, getting a mortgage, getting housing assistance, or engaging in other housing-related activities. And then there are also additional protections that would apply to federally assisted housing. But beyond that, there's also a goal to reverse housing discrimination. We call that affirmatively furthering fair housing. That's defined as taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities that are free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. So it's not just enough to prevent acts of discrimination. It's acknowledging that we've got a history that was full of really problematic laws and practices that perpetuated inequality in our housing system that still have impacts today. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that everyone has equal access to housing opportunities. And that's what affirmatively furthering fair housing is all about. So our fair housing laws cover the sale and rental of housing as well as housing related transactions. Some people say, well, what are housing related transactions? That seems really vague. It's the industries that surround housing, such as getting a mortgage, getting your home inspected, getting insurance, appraising a home. All of these professions and industries that can impact access to housing, access to financing, and housing value. Fair housing laws cover a wide variety of types of housing, anywhere from apartments to single-family homes, mobile home parks, condominiums, public housing, nursing homes, dormitories, and more. And when we talk about types of discrimination or discrimination theories, I want to highlight two main theories. The first one is disparate treatment. That's treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class. So because we're discussing individuals with disabilities primarily today, we'll use the example of someone seeing an individual with a disability and saying, you know what, I see that you have a disability. I don't think that this property is safe for you, so I'm not going to rent to you. So they're treated differently because of their disability. They're denied housing. Disparate impact, on the other hand, can be a little bit more subtle. So it's a policy that looks neutral on its face, but it impacts a member of a protected class in a disproportionate way. So say if a housing provider would have a policy that they're only looking at earned income, employment income, when they're looking at qualifications to rent. So that doesn't mention individuals with disability, doesn't say anything about that in the policy, but it may have a disproportionate impact or disparate impact on individuals with disability who may be more likely to receive benefits or other types of income aside from employment. So it's got a disparate impact on that group of individuals, and that policy may keep individuals out of housing. All right, I want to touch on the protected classes that we have. You can see there's two lists here. There's the federal list under the Fair Housing Act, and there's 7 main protected classes. So race, color, national origin, familial status, religion, sex, and disability. And you can see that under our state statute, we actually have additional protected classes as well. So we've got those first main 7 plus age 40 and above, ancestry, and the use, handling, or training of support animals for disability. And I do want to mention that under our regulations that were passed in 2023 and finalized then, the term sex does include sexual orientation, gender identity, as well as some other further specifications under that protected class. So it is a very inclusive definition of sex. And we do have information about that on our website and some flyers under our publications. And we are actively seeking to make sure that everyone fully understands that you can file a complaint under the protected class of sex that's inclusive. But I'd like to take a little bit of time to define disability specifically. So that's defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of a person's major life activities. So some examples you can see on the screen here, they include caring for oneself, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, or working. This is not an exhaustive list, but just some examples. So you can see that some of these major life activities, you might notice that impairment right away as someone comes into your office, as someone emails or speaks to you. It might be readily apparent, but some of these you wouldn't know unless it was disclosed, unless someone said, hey, I do have a disability. I need reasonable accommodation to use it and enjoy my housing. But regardless of that, whether it's apparent or not, it would fall under fair housing protections as long as it's covered by that definition of substantially limiting one or more of a person's major life activities. And the Fair Housing Act extends that protection to those who have a disability, to those who have a history of a disability, as well as those who are perceived or regarded as having a disability. So this was important because some folks who don't actually have a disability, those who might have a record of having a disability in the past, or there might be assumptions that they have a disability, perhaps a mental health or developmental disability. They might receive different treatment from a housing provider, from a lender, from a realtor, based on that individual's perception of their abilities and their conditions. So even if they don't specifically have a disability, but they're treated differently on they're being regarded as having disability or their medical history, they still could file a complaint. And the Fair Housing Act does provide protections, as well as the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act on that basis. I want to specify that there are a few disability-related exemptions. So individuals who are currently using illegal drugs, controlled substances, they would be exempted from disability-related protections. So I want to specify that that's for folks who are actively using, not those who are in recovery. If someone is in recovery, they would be entitled to disability-related protections, but those who are actively using would not be entitled to those same protections. Additionally, individuals who pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others are also exempt from disability-related protection. All right, so you can see on the screen here, there are a number of different actions that are considered to be discriminatory if they are taken on the basis of someone's protected class. So those can include discriminatory statements, whether they are published in the newspaper, online, made in person, inquiries, discriminatory inquiries about someone in the process of renting housing, buying housing, seeking financing, steering an individual to a specific neighborhood, away from a neighborhood, away from an area of a housing complex because of their protected class, refusing to sell, lease, or finance housing, providing an unfair appraisal that's biased based on their protected class, predatory lending, redlining, discriminating in the terms or conditions of someone's lease or sale or financing of their housing, or providing unequal services and facilities, such as use of the various areas of the facility, such as the pool, the laundry room, the gym, services, which would include maintenance services, if that's not provided equally, if folks can't equally access areas of the facility based on their protected class, that would be discriminatory. Sexual harassment, whether that's quid pro quo or creating a hostile environment, is considered to be discriminatory. And then refusal to provide reasonable accommodations and modifications for individuals with disabilities. Individuals with disabilities have protections against all of these discriminatory actions, but refusal to provide reasonable accommodations and modifications in housing is specific to individuals with disabilities. So we're going to focus on that, and we're going to discuss that a little bit further. All right. So what's the difference between a reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification? Well, a reasonable modification is a structural change that's made to the premises. And a reasonable accommodation is a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, a policy, practice, or service. So I know we've got folks on here with a wide range of expertise and experience with housing. So I'd love to invite you to take a moment and put in the chat a reasonable accommodation or modification that you're aware of. What's something that could be considered a reasonable accommodation or modification? Could be something you've heard of, could be something that you've processed as a housing provider. Just looking to get the wisdom of the group and see how many we can come up with. All right, a ramp in a parking lot. Absolutely. Handrails in the bathroom. Needing a first floor unit. An additional bedroom for a live-in aid. Absolutely. So the first three, those would be considered reasonable modifications, but a change in policy to have that additional bedroom for a live-in aid, that would be an accommodation because that might be looking at the policy there. Flashing smoke detectors is a reasonable modification. Modifying the rent due date based on someone's disability-related income. Yeah, that's a great example of a reasonable accommodation, change in policy. An ADA parking space. Yeah, absolutely. Large print accessible documents. Emotional support animal. Reasonable accommodations. Great variety. Thank you so much for participating and for putting that information in the chat. So how should a reasonable accommodation request be handled? I first want to note that this request can be made at any point in the tenancy. It can be made as someone first calls in about the unit or sends an email making an inquiry. It could be as someone's touring the unit. It could be as you're signing the lease at move-in day, 5 years, 10 years, 25 years into the tenancy, even right before move out. Why is this? Well, someone's disability-related needs could change. Maybe they didn't need this accommodation when they were looking at the unit, but they moved in and they realized that their needs changed, or there's something about the property, about the policies that is not allowing them to use and enjoy the property. But whenever this request is made, it should be processed and accommodated, assuming that it's reasonable. This request can be made in writing, or it can be made verbally. Either one is equally valid. Now, we do strongly recommend to tenants as they are making these requests to do it in writing, because then you've got documentation of when you made that request, what you've requested, and hopefully you receive that response in writing as well. That way you've got it for your records, your housing provider has it for their records. There's no questions about it. But guidelines, federal guidelines are very clear that the verbal requests are valid as well. Now, the request needs to be reasonable and necessary for the tenant to use and enjoy the property. So there needs to be a connection between the disability-related need and the request that's made. It can't be something extraneous that's not reasonable and necessary. And the housing provider has the responsibility to treat the tenants who are making these requests fairly and to respond back in a timely manner. HUD's guidelines state that within 10 days is considered to be reasonable. So when presented with a reasonable accommodation request, a housing provider should establish 2 criteria. So first of all, does the person who's seeking this accommodation fall under the protected class of disability? And then secondly, does this person have a disability-related need for this accommodation? So if the answers to both of these are yes, and the request is reasonable, how do you think the housing provider should respond? Yes or no? You can feel free to pop that in the chat. You can react. Let me know. What do you think? Yes or no? Should this request be granted? Yes. Thank you. That's right. The request should be granted. All right. Thank you for all of those responses in the chat. I always like to make sure that folks are hanging with me, especially on these trainings when I don't see all of you staying awake in the room and we don't have cameras on. So thank you for your participation. Now, from a lot of housing providers that I talk to, they want to know, well, how can I verify that this is a real need, that this is an individual with a disability, and this is a request in response to their need? So a housing provider can request some documentation if the disability is not observable. If that disability is observable, so say it's an individual who uses a wheelchair that's requesting a ramp to be able to get into their unit, you can see that that individual has a disability. So any further documentation that's requested would just be putting additional barriers to that individual using and enjoying their housing. So that would not be appropriate. But if that disability is not observable, then a housing provider can request proof of need. So oftentimes this looks like a note from a provider. It doesn't have to be from a primary physician. It can be from a nurse, from a physical therapist, from a mental health professional, from an optometrist, anyone that's familiar with that individual, has reasonable knowledge of their condition, can write that note and state that this is an individual who has a disability, who's eligible for disability-related protections, and this is the accommodation that they're requesting. Some alternative documentation that can be submitted that would establish disability. That includes a determination of disability from a governmental agency, a receipt of disability benefits or services, as well as eligibility for housing assistance because of a disability. So in these cases, an external agency has already done due diligence to make sure that they're eligible for that assistance, for those housing benefits, for those services. So you wouldn't need to get that additional verification. But not all requests need to be provided. So a housing provider can deny the request in a few situations. So if the needed documentation isn't provided, if that specific request would pose a direct threat to the health or safety of others, which cannot be speculative. It has to be something that's documented, that's clear, not something that's based on assumptions. If the request causes substantial physical damage to the property, if the request would place an undue financial burden on the provider, or if the request would fundamentally alter the nature of the provider's operations. In those situations, a housing provider could deny that accommodation request. A housing provider should be cautious in the way they approach this reasonable accommodation request. They want to make sure that they're not asking the nature or severity of the disability. They should not be asking questions that lead the tenant to disclose any privileged medical information. They should not ask to see medical records, and they should not ask if a tenant is able to live independently. A housing provider doesn't have a need or a right to know the specifics of a tenant's medical situation, their condition, all of that. All they need to know is, do they have a disability-related need? And is that connection there? Is that request connected to the need? All right, and the last aspect of this that I want to cover before going into the specifics of hoarding, and I know it's taken me 27 minutes to get here, but I think it's been important groundwork to cover to understand how we engage with this issue, is the interactive process. So if the reasonable accommodation or modification request can't be granted, then it's the housing provider's responsibility to engage in the interactive process to see if there are reasonable alternatives that may meet this individual's needs. So this is a discussion. This is a back and forth. This should happen in a timely manner. There shouldn't be unnecessary delays. And it may take negotiation or conversation to determine an effective resolution. It's important that this is fully documented and saved in the housing provider's records, in the tenant's records, so that way there's very clear, there's a clear timeline of what this conversation, what happened, when it happened, what was decided. Just because a housing provider needs to deny that initial request because it's not feasible, because it's an undue burden, it's outside of the scope of that housing provider's initial role, well, they need to explore next. Is there an alternative way that we can meet this individual's disability-related needs? How can we make sure that this housing is accessible, that these barriers are overcome, so that individual has a full range of housing choice? And that's what the interactive process is about. Sometimes that can be challenging. Sometimes it can be helpful to have a neutral party in that conversation. So sometimes it can be important to reach out to a local fair housing agency to see if they can assist. If you've got questions, if you've got concerns, if you want to make sure that you're handling this in an appropriate manner. But let's get on to the substance of today's conversation, because we're talking about addressing hoarding situations in housing. I want to start out with the definition in the DSM-5. So this was published first in 2013, and it's defined as an obsessive need to acquire and failure to use or discard a significant amount of possessions, even if the items are worthless, hazardous, or unsanitary. It's marked by a perceived need to save these items, distress with discarding them, accumulation of possessions that congest and clutter active living spaces, clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, and it's not attributable to another mental health condition or explained by symptoms of another mental health disorder. So hoarding disorder is actually pretty common. By nature, it happens behind closed doors. So oftentimes you may not know unless you're personally involved, professionally involved with someone, you may not know that they're dealing with this. And there have been a range of estimates on how common it is, but according to a meta-analysis looking at a number of studies around this, approximately 2.5% of the population has hoarding disorder, according to a 2019 meta-analysis. And you'll get the link when I send out these slides. It does impact both men and women, although women are more likely to be impacted by it. And it often emerges in adolescence and early adulthood, increasing in severity over time. There are often co-occurring disorders that someone may be dealing with, such as depression, ADHD, and OCD. So it's not always a standalone thing. There may be other challenges that someone is experiencing. But what are the impacts? How does this impact both the individual, members of their household, as well as the community? And I do want to give credit where credit is due. This information is sourced from the Philadelphia Hoarding Task Force. So at the individual level, hoarding can lead to conflict with loved ones, whether they're inside the household, living with this individual, and that's impacting their own living space, or whether they are living independently and simply noticing the conditions and wanting to help their loved ones. There are health and safety risks involved as the unit is not usable, as there is an accumulation of belongings, as they're unable to prepare and store food because the kitchen isn't usable. They're often unable to have people visit. There's a lot of shame and stigma surrounding hoarding disorder, and a lot of folks don't want to engage in those conversations, take the steps to get help. There are risks of losing housing or utility shutoffs, and there are often financial problems with this accumulation of belongings. Additional mental health problems, and then shame, embarrassment, defensiveness, stigma, and trauma that an individual may experience. But it doesn't just impact that individual, it also impacts the community at large. So it impacts the housing provider, neighbors that are living nearby. They will likely notice the disrepair, the maintenance hazards, infestations, particularly if it's in a row home, in a multifamily unit. You know, if there's food, paper, organic material that's building up, there's going to be infestations of pests, of bugs, of rodents that may impact both the individual as well as their neighbors. There may be citations that are issued because of the condition of the property. Code enforcement may be brought in to address it. Depending on the level of hoarding, it could lead to structural damage, blocked exits, citations, and potential condemnation of the property if it's severe. It can impact emergency responders and impact their ability to do their job. If there's a fire in the property, they might not be able to get in. The amount of paper and combustible material can make it more likely for fire. Medical personnel may not be able to get in to assist someone if there's really narrow pathways for them to get to different rooms. Health department may need to get involved if there's infestations and other health hazards. If there's older adults in the homes, there may be senior services involved. People may not be able to be discharged from hospitals. If there's children in the home, Child Protective Services may get involved. And then if there's animals in the home, Animal Protective Services may get involved as well. And I'm not going to get into depth in terms of intervention and treatment because this is going to look very different from person to person, and I'm not a mental health professional. That's not my expertise, so I don't want to overstep in that space. But I do want to let you know that effective treatment of this condition will likely involve cooperation and partnership with a variety of professionals, whether that's case management, code enforcement, and mental health providers. And in Pennsylvania, we've got a wide variety from really large cities with a well-developed infrastructure to small communities without as many resources and services. So there's going to be differing levels of resources available and professionals that are available to address this. Sometimes get the question, well, is this actually hoarding? Is someone just being messy? What's the difference between clutter and hoarding? And a helpful question to kind of guide that conversation is, can the room be used for the function that it's designed for? So when we look at the image on the left, I'd love to hear your response in the chat. Do you think this room can be used for what it's designed for? It's a bedroom, right? Can someone use it as a bedroom? Yeah, absolutely. It's messy for sure. And there are belongings that are clearly need to be put away, but it's still a functional room. Now on the right-hand side, that's a kitchen, but can it be used for its purpose to store and cook food? Right, it can't. There's too many belongings. You can't get to the appliances. You can't get to the sink. You can't really navigate that space. So I would say no. We can't use that room as it currently is for the function that it's designed for. So that is a situation that I would suggest that resident is engaging with hoarding. So where's that intersection between hoarding and reasonable accommodation and fair housing? It's in the reasonable accommodation process. So under the Fair Housing Amendments Act, a person who has a hoarding disorder may be entitled to a reasonable accommodation of policies, practices, or services when such accommodations may be necessary to afford a person equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. So you can look at the case Douglas versus Creeksville Corporation. A tenant made a request for a reasonable accommodation plan to clean a unit due to the tenant's mental disability and avoid an eviction. And that was considered to be reasonable under the Fair Housing Act. So when we looked at the definition of disability impacting one or more of a person's major life activities, it's clear that when households impacted by hoarding disorder, that a number of functions of a household may be impacted, and it can happen in a number of ways. So a housing provider should approach a request around hoarding as a reasonable accommodation request. So we're going to look at this from a couple different perspectives and different actions and approaches that we would recommend taking, starting first with the housing provider. So a housing provider may enforce their lease terms. It's their responsibility to make sure that their property is safe and in good condition, and a lease often has terms that would address this. So the landlord may notice that there are issues, and they can certainly say, you need to bring your unit into compliance. You need to make sure that this is in good condition. And it's the tenant's responsibility to ask for help or reasonable accommodations. Do you think the tenant needs to say the words reasonable accommodation in the request? Feel free to let me know in the chat. Do you think it's important that they say reasonable accommodation? I'm seeing some no's and some yeses. So while it can be helpful for the housing provider to know, hey, this is a reasonable accommodation request, because that would trigger a housing provider to say, oh yeah, it's my responsibility under the fair housing laws. You don't need any magic words. You don't need to say that term. If the housing provider should understand that in a hoarding situation, which is impacting one or more of a tenant's major life activities, that would be covered. So if a tenant's asking for assistance in this type of a situation, if they're saying, hey, I need some time, I need to bring in some outside supports to bring this up to the standards that you have in the lease, to make it habitable again, then the housing provider is responsible to accommodate that. It's important that you're prioritizing the safety needs first, because likely it's going to be on a big scale. There are likely going to be numerous things that have to be done, and it can be overwhelming. So prioritizing, making sure that that entrance and that exit can be accessed, that you can get to the bathroom, the kitchen, make sure the electrical panels are clear, things like that before picking up the stacks of belongings that are on a couch. It's unlikely to be successful if a tenant is working at this on their own. So if they have supports that can assist them, whether it's a friend, whether it's a family member, whether it's a social service provider, a supports coordinator, invite that tenant to bring them in on these conversations so they have supports. It's not the housing provider's responsibility to diagnose a tenant, to recommend courses of treatment, any of that. Your primary goal is to resolve this situation. And you want to be cautious and conscious of attachment to these items, to use neutral language. I wouldn't want someone dealing with me to be talking about my junk, my crap, my trash. Likewise, I would treat someone that has these items to be dealt with talking about belongings, possessions, items, neutral language, so that way they don't feel like there's additional stigma or judgment in addressing the situation. It's not going to be productive to these conversations. I'm not going to go through this slide because it is very fine print and a lot of information, but I wanted to provide the link and to let you all know that this is available. This is from the Institute for Challenging Disorganization. It's a clutter hoarding scale that can talk about some of the indicators of hoarding, from very minimal impact to the most extreme situations, as well as how that can impact the various functioning of the household, whether it's from the actual structural safety, to animals and pests that might be involved, how it impacts the functioning of a household, impacts health and safety, and protective equipment that might be needed to address it. So this could be a resource as you're working with your tenant, with your maintenance team to address this situation. But if you are supporting an individual with hoarding disorder, whether from a professional relationship as a social service provider, whether you're a friend or a family member, it's important to start that conversation, and to start it also using neutral language, helping to work with that tenant to make a plan, contacting the landlord to address it, letting them know that this is an issue that they want to work on, that they want to address, to make sure that that their apartment, that their unit, their house is in good condition. If there are other supports that can assist them, invite them to bring them in on conversations and explore options for mental health supports if that individual is open to treatment. When you're establishing a plan, it's important to be specific. So setting standards in specific areas, making sure it's clear what's being discussed, what should be done. Being clear on what that timeline looks like step by step. So by next week, we need to make sure that you can get to that emergency exit. 2 weeks from now, want to make sure that you can get to that access panel. and being really clear and documenting this in writing. We want to establish who's going to be responsible for this and set progress checks to make sure that that there's accountability there. And I apologize. I apparently have not been moving around enough, and the lights turned off in my office. Here we go. We're back. Let's see. Making sure that that there's clear communication on any services that the tenant might be utilizing. And if other folks are being involved in this conversation, having releases on file. So that way it's clear that the tenant has authorized this conversation with these other members and that the housing provider has had release to do so. Now, I'm not going to paint an overly optimistic picture. This is a long-term issue. This is something that's really complicated. And it can take a long time to resolve. So you want to make sure that you've got an appropriate framework in place, making sure that you've got a method to check on progress to make sure that this is resolved and is in good condition moving forward. As I mentioned earlier, resources may vary community to community member. If you're a housing provider looking for resources, when you've got a tenant that's experiencing this and has identified that they don't have any resources, start by exploring what social service providers may be in the area, may be already connected to the tenant. In many communities, the United Way's 211 service may be a great place to start searching for services. The Pennsylvania Link to Aging and Disability Resources Network, they also have some resources. I did find several hoarding task forces that are active in different areas of the state, and you can find those links there as well. But say there's a tenant that tried to engage in the interactive process, that asked for help for that reasonable accommodation, and felt that their request was denied. They have the right to file a complaint at our agency, and I wanted to make sure to provide that link as well as our Fair Housing line where they can get some more information. If they believe that they've experienced, or if you believe you've experienced your fair housing rights have been violated, we want to know about it. So please reach out to our agency, since we are the enforcement agency for the state. I'd like to thank you for attending this training today. I also want to let you know that we've got additional resources available. We've got brochures and fact sheets. We do these trainings every month. Next month, I believe we're going to be talking about domestic violence in housing. In May, we'll be talking about accessibility, and in June, we'll be talking about affirmatively furthering for housing. We tackle different topics each month and invite you to join us to spread the word to your colleagues, others in your networks, because we want to make sure that fair housing information is accessible. We can also set up specialized trainings for you and your colleagues. Community members, anyone who's looking for fair housing training, please reach out to me. I'll have my email on a following slide. Would love to connect. We've got our Fair Housing line, which is answered by trained staff that would be happy to answer your questions. And then there's also an affirmatively furthering fair housing task force that's active in working to promote housing opportunities throughout the state. And I'd love to connect you if you're interested in learning more about that. I see a question in the chat about resources that are available electronically. You can find our brochures and our fact sheets on our website, www.phrc.pa.gov, and you can check that out. If you have any questions about reaching out specifically for information, please feel free to contact me via email. I also want to highlight that in less than a month, on Tuesday, April 16th, we'll be holding our annual Housing Equality Conference. It's going to be out in Pittsburgh this year. We still have a couple tickets left. It is free to attend, but you do need to register. So you can find that information on our website as well. I'll be sending out that link with our materials from today as well. I promised my contact information, and it is here. You can call our office. You can reach me via email. And I would love for you to take out your phone, scan that QR code, and let me know what you thought of today's training, if it was helpful, if there were things that were unclear. If there's topics that you want to know going forward, we'd love to make those topics available to you in the space of fair housing. Also, if you want regular updates from our agency, I would love to add you to our fair housing newsletter. So you'll have a spot where you can enter your contact information and I can connect you from there. But it looks like I timed it out well. We've got 10 extra minutes. Please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat, whether it's about hoarding specifically, any other fair housing questions, reasonable accommodations questions. Would be happy to answer any questions that you have. I'm going to look back through the chat just to see if there's any questions that I missed. If you're not comfortable putting a question in the chat, you can also raise your hand, and I'm happy to have you to voice your question as well. All right, I see a question from, I believe it's Dorit or Dory. Please feel free to go ahead. Let me see, I'm going to allow your mic. All right, are you able to ask your question?
Here. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Very good presentation. I really appreciate it. I'm a psychiatrist, so I may have clients that, deal with this kind of things. I wanted to ask you actually a technical question. Is there a way to get some kind of a training certificate for today's lecture?
Yes, I'm not able to offer any continuing education credits, but I can offer you a certificate stating that you have participated in this session, and I'd be happy to email that to you. So please feel free to, or please make sure that you email me with that request, or you can put it in the notes when you fill out a feedback survey, and I'll make sure to get that to you within the next week.
Yeah, I'm not able to access the chat for some reason. I can't.
Okay, if you can't get to the chat, just email me once. You can either email me at bmellinger@pa.gov or just respond to my email when I send out the resources, and I'll make sure to get you that certificate.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. All right, I think I saw a couple questions in the chat. Let's see. Do tenants with service animals have to provide proof of veterinary care, vaccines, and licensure? So if there are state or local regulations and requirements regarding that, if there's a registration requirement, anything like that, of course, an animal would need to, or the owner of the animal would need to comply with those local regulations, but nothing beyond what's required. You wouldn't want to put additional barriers against an individual with a disability to have that assistance animal. See a question, why doesn't a hoarder need to specifically state that they need help with an accommodation? It's because it's the case with any reasonable accommodation request. We don't want to put that barrier of having that technical language there. So it should be generally understood that individual has a disability. They're making this request because of their disability-related need, and that's appropriate. That's enough. It doesn't have to have that specific terminology. Of course, if an individual would say, I need a reasonable accommodation, that just makes it exceptionally clear. So I recommend it. If you're making an accommodation request, if you're supporting someone, please feel free to use that terminology, but it's not required. All right, I see a question with a fair housing issue in an apartment complex. Is it better to approach the building manager, the management company, or both. I would start with the individual that's your point of contact for issues with your lease, your property manager, probably as a first point of contact, since they would likely be the one that's making the decisions on lease violations, on that communication, rather than dealing with the building maintenance team. Great questions, everyone. Thanks so much for asking them. All right. I will leave this open for one more minute, but again, I'd like to thank you for joining. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your questions, and I will be in touch soon. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and as we're coming up on April as Fair Housing Month, please explore what fair housing activities might be going on in your community. It's a great time to be connecting with fair housing topics and issues and resources. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everyone.